I think we can start up. So if you're tuning in, thanks for spending some time of your Valentine's Day with the UBI Center. I'm here with Nate Golden, research associate with the UBI Center. My name is Max Ghenis. I am the president of the UBI Center, and we're going to be talking a little bit about child allowances. Child allowances are a UBI for kids. So the idea of giving every parent a certain amount of money every month for every child that they have. And this has been definitely in the news lately. We've been thinking about it for a few months because there's just a lot of evidence that intervening with children in terms of reducing childhood poverty has a lot of downstream benefits. And there's been a really exciting bill from Senator Mitt Romney. It's also a major part of Biden's relief proposal. So a lot going on the child allowance side. And the way we're going to structure this is I'll start by asking Nate a few questions about some child allowance research he's done. And then we will turn it over and he'll ask me about some stuff I've looked into on the Family Security Act. So with that, yeah, I also want to mention, well, Nate, why don't you give actually a bit of an intro, because I think you have a unique perspective on child poverty and all that.
Yeah, I'm currently in Taiwan, serving a Fulbright, but typically I'm a math teacher in the United States. I work in Title I schools, so I work with children primarily growing up in poverty. So I have a lot of anecdotal experience working with kids growing up in poverty, but I also approach it from like a holistic perspective with the UBI Center. So I kind of see it on the ground, but also at the research level.
Awesome. And why would you say child poverty is important? Why should we pay attention as a country?
Yeah, I think it'll be helpful to just quickly define poverty. When we talk about poverty, we're usually talking about SPM poverty, which is how the government and researchers primarily measure poverty. It's essentially a measure that takes the expected cost of living for a family, right at the poverty line, multiplies it by 1.2 based on the cost of living in the region that they live in and their housing situation, and sets a poverty threshold based on how many people are in the house. So, like for a family or for an individual, depending on the region, it can range from like $10,000 to $20,000 in some parts of California, where the housing is really expensive. So child poverty is important because, when children are growing up under this threshold, they may not have access to stable housing, food on the table every day, and just some of the comfort of living that a lot of us are accustomed to growing up with as children. And this can affect them in a variety of ways. It may sound obvious that child poverty is bad, but research has really shown the specifics that child poverty can decrease student outcomes. It can cause more mental health problems for kids, decrease health outcomes, increase the likelihood that kids commit a crime, and can cost the economy up to $1 trillion a year. That one study showed that's 5% of GDP. And most of those losses are coming from decreases in economic productivity and increased spending on health and crime.
Yeah, so major downstream impacts. Also, you mentioned the SPM poverty. That's a supplemental poverty measure. Unlike the official poverty measure, it accounts for housing costs and taxes and transfers and all that. So it's kind of a nice way for us to evaluate public policy because when we're giving different amounts to children or adults, families, we can see what the impact of that is on the poverty rate. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, what child poverty affects long-term outcomes like education, health, earnings, even life expectancy, right? And how do they figure out those kinds of results? Like what kind of studies go into that?
So we've seen some really interesting studies that really looks at how poverty specifically does it. So there's been some research that looks at essentially when a random cash transfer occurs. So studies that showed right when states adjusted their EITCs, or the famous one with the Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, where casinos started sharing their profit with people in the region, and researchers were able to control and look at, okay, children who got some of the profit sharing that was usually about $4,000 a year for a family, versus children who are very similar close by who didn't. How did the outcomes vary for these very similar children? And the only difference is one subset of kids were in families that got the benefit, others were not. And that research has been really, I feel like, pivotal in the child allowance movement to show, these kids that got the benefit, they did better in school, they stayed in school longer, they're still tracking the kids, they earn more as adults. So studies like this one, and this one specifically, really highlight that it is not other conditions, it is like poverty specifically is impacting kids like on a very real short and long-term level.
Yeah, so it shows that child poverty is actually the cause. It's not just correlation, or there's not some other factor that's going on. We can be pretty confident that if you reduce childhood poverty, it's actually going to change these outcomes, and there's a causal link there. So what's a child allowance? How does this fit into the child poverty research?
Yeah, a child allowance is really simple. It's giving parents a check every month to kind of subsidize the cost of parenting. It's not giving money to kids directly. It is giving money to parents to take care of their kids. And a lot of countries do this. They just give parents a monthly check. Typically with a child allowance, it's like a reoccurring payment we're thinking of. And like monthly seems to make the most sense because that's how people budget. So a lot of other rich countries do some type of child allowance where they just give parents a monthly check based on how many kids they have. When we say like a universal child allowance, we mean everyone gets it no matter what. And a lot of countries phase out for higher income earners, but they don't phase in for low income earners like the United States does with the child tax credit. The child tax credit, because it phases in, you're not eligible at all if you earn less than $2,500 a year. It phases in at 15%. So research from the Century Foundation has shown that over a third of children don't get the full benefit, which is $2,000 a year per kid. And half of Black children and half of Hispanic children don't get the full benefit.
Yeah, so I guess the major differences between a child allowance and what we have today is that the child allowance or the child tax credit phases in with income, and also it's only paid once a year, so it can't really smooth income in the right way. And we'll talk about some other child poverty alleviation strategies that the U.S. has and how effective they are. There are some extremely targeted policies that also have shrunk over time and have some other issues. But yeah, so there's opportunity to consolidate, and we'll see how Romney kind of did that.
Yeah.
So it's probably a good time to maybe share some of the research you've done showing how child allowances can reduce poverty.
Sure. So
I'm curious, first of all, like what's the cost? How much, if we want to give a child allowance, what would that set back?
So we have about 74 million children in the United States right now. So, every $100 a month, we're looking at about $88 billion in new spending. But the child allowance proposals that we're seeing through the American Family Act and Romney's Family Security Act, they don't actually cost that much because a lot of the savings come from replacing the child tax credit with a child allowance. But yeah, like the general thinking is every $100 a month that we add, that's about $88 billion, which is about 2% of government spending in a normal year. It's a much lower percent this year because of all of the pandemic relief, but in a normal year, every $100 we add to children, that's about 2% of the federal government spending. So we actually looked in let me pull this up a little better. So UBI Center conducted some research looking at child allowances and kind of put it all into one place. So you can visit a child allowance site, ubicenter.org. Here we look at some of the empirical research that Max and I just discussed about child allowances. We look at some of the policies. Max is going to go into the Family Security Act in a moment here. And we did some simulations that kind of look at the real impact of a child allowance in the United States. I know we talked about cost before, but that can be kind of hard for some people to internalize. So if you're thinking about cost in terms of, well, how much new taxes do we need? That this first chart kind of shows that real quick. So like for $100 a month, we would need a flat tax on income at about 1%. And this is taxable income. So you're looking at the average person's taxes increasing about 1% for every $100. And that's at the federal level. We did also do research at the state level, but I think for today we'll just kind of talk about child allowances at the federal level, because that's where the most momentum seems to be. So yeah, we're talking about 1% for every $100. And so if we did that, what would be the impact? So this first chart here looks at the distributional effect. So let me bring it to about $300 a month. So if we did a child allowance for about $300 a month, you can see families towards the bottom of the income distribution are on average having their resources changed by about $3,000. And this money, because it's being funded by a tax on income, is primarily coming from those at the top. So even though it's a universal child allowance, we hear things a lot like, oh, well, why should we be giving money to people at the top? Well, they're not net winners in this situation. It is redistribution. So like, we are sending money to the people at the top, and there's benefits to just doing it universally and not means testing and taxing away that money later. So you can kind of see here that the more the child allowance increases, the larger the benefits at the bottom and the more money that comes from the top.
And that's not a progressive tax, right?
Yeah, and that's not a progressive tax. That's just a flat tax on income. So at $400, like right here, we're looking at about a 4% flat income tax. So everyone pays it. So even though we have taxes increasing at the same rate at the bottom, because people at the bottom have less income, they're paying less taxes than the people at the top, and everyone's getting the same benefit. So we get progressive outcomes from a flat tax and a flat benefit. So it's pretty cool to see that. So that's one way to look at inequality. Another way to look at inequality is the Gini coefficient, which I'm sure most people in economics are familiar with. And this kind of shows here that right now the US Gini coefficient is really high. Inequality in the US is really high. And a child allowance is funded but with a flat tax could have a measurable impact on inequality. So as we go to like $300, we're talking about a couple percentage point decrease in the Gini coefficient. But I think people don't typically see child allowances more as it's more of a tool to fight poverty than inequality. So the most important numbers I think come from looking at poverty. And so this map I think is really cool. It looks at every state because that's going to matter when senators go to vote on the bill. They want to know how much money, how is this going to impact my state? So the general rule of thumb here for every state, and it doesn't follow every state to a T, that about $300, we're going to cut child poverty in half in most states. So max is in California, a $300 federal child allowance funded by a federal income tax is going to reduce child poverty by 49%, so about cut it in half. That still leaves almost 10% of children in California in poverty. The child poverty rate in California is really high at almost 20%. I was raised in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania falls by about 43%. We can zoom in here on DC, where I most recently was teaching, and child poverty is cut again almost in half in DC for about $300 a month. So we're talking like, for small increases, I won't use small, but for about $300 a month, we're cutting it in half. Larger amounts, we can reduce child poverty even more. So this is a pretty cool interactive map that I really encourage you to visit. Look at your state, and you can also do it at the state level as well. So if you want to reach out to state level legislators and look, okay, in California, if we did a $300 a month child allowance at the state level, we're still cutting it in half. The numbers don't change too much. But it's very possible for child allowances to happen at the state level as well to supplement or any child allowance policy that happens at the federal level. You know, you can always add money on top of it.
What do you mean by the
So
state level, Nate?
yeah, so when we were talking about public policy, you know, at the federal level, states, or federal level, that's, we're talking about Congress, you know, like Mitt Romney's bill would happen at the federal level. At the state level, every state has a state legislator as well. So there are states that are completely in control by Democrats who have an opportunity to pass income tax increases to fund child allowances just within the state. So when we click on state tax here, we're just talking about the state enacting its own policy. It's not happening outside of the state to raise money to fund a child allowance. So states collect income taxes too, most states, and they can raise more revenue by increasing those taxes and redistribute it to, you know, parents to help fight child poverty. So you can see the benefit of any state here. I think this is one of my favorite charts that we've created. And then lastly, I'll just highlight one more chart. I'm going to go by race. You can see right now that the U.S. has really high rate of Black child poverty. Almost a quarter of Black children live in poverty, and this is all children here. So if we just add, you know, let's say $200 a month, so even for lower levels, it can have a huge impact. For $200 a month, we cut Black child poverty by 40%. That's, you know, that's obviously a lot, and overall child poverty by almost 40%. So this has the opportunity to narrow also the gap between the amount of white children and Black children and other races living in poverty. So I think there's kind of something for everyone with a child allowance, no matter how you're looking at U.S. public policy, whether it's through an inequality lens, an absolute poverty lens, or even if you're looking at it from like an equity lens through via race or any other metric. A child allowance makes the U.S. a better and fairer economy.
And all of this is on top of the existing safety net we have, right? So
yeah. So this, because we did it at the state level, it gets a little tricky on it, like, okay, should we be repealing the child tax credit in our simulation? So this leaves everything else intact. So this doesn't change anything except for increasing taxes to fund the child allowance, which is obviously different than once we get to the American Family Act here and start discussing that. It's different proposal than what we're simulating here.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Nate. Yeah, I think keep in mind that $300 cutting child poverty in half, because it's actually not that different a number in terms of when you start replacing the existing welfare policies, which really indicates that the existing policies aren't necessarily cutting poverty as effectively as they could be.
Yeah. So, and I guess just the last point I'll make is, you know, when we talk about child allowances, we often hear like, oh, well, why should people without children support this policy? And there's obvious moral reasons to support it, right? From, you know, caring about people besides yourself, but even from a completely selfish lens, if you want to live in a safer, richer, and healthier society, there's an argument to say that the most bang for your buck comes from fighting child poverty, because it's going to have benefits in both the short and the long run. So with that, I think we'll kind of switch places here. So I talked a lot about like child allowances at the abstract, but they're in the news today, primarily because Mitt Romney has proposed the Family Security Act, which is his version of a child allowance. And I'm going to kind of just pass it over to Max to like tell us what the Family Security Act is.
Yeah, so the Family Security Act actually kind of comes on the heels of another child allowance bill that came out of the Democratic side, which is called the American Family Act. And the idea there is to really expand the child tax credit and make it monthly. That's really the heart of both of those proposals. So the American Family Act was created by Michael Bennet. He's a Democratic senator, and Sherrod Brown, also Democratic senator. And what that created was $250 a month for kids aged 6 to 17, and $300 a month for kids under age 6. So the Romney plan actually takes that and says, okay, how are we going to pay for that? And it basically turns those other programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, temporary assistance for needy families, and also repeals some tax deductions that really benefit high earners largely, and turns that into a budget neutral plan to create $250 a month for age 6 to 17 and $350 a month, so a little bit more generous than the American Family Act, for kids under age 6. And that's almost universal as well. So it does phase out with high incomes, being income above 400,000 for married couples or 200,000 for singles. But another change relative to these other child allowance bills and even the existing child tax credit is it sends the money through the Social Security Administration. So they have experience, they send tens of millions of checks every month. And this would be just another kind of program that they do. And then it would be recouped on the back end for these higher earners via the tax code every April.
Yeah. Do you want to just talk a little bit about, I mean, we touched a little on the child tax credit, but some of the other ways that this simplifies the current system?
Yeah, it's probably worth, I'll present my screen. And this concept of a trapezoid comes up a lot in these welfare economics policies in the US, at least. We love our trapezoids. So I'll just show what one of these looks like. This is the child tax credit figure right here. Oops. So you can kind of see what the way this works is if you earn $0 as a parent, you actually get nothing from the child tax credit. It phases in. So once you start earning closer to 25, 30K, it depends on your family structure and things like that, then you start getting the maximum of $2,000. And then it phases out for high earners as well. So the earned income tax credit is kind of similar to this. It also features a trapezoid shape where it phases in with income. It has a maximum amount, and then it phases out with income as well. But the EITC is largely a family benefit. It doesn't really help adults who don't have kids. It has caps out about $540 a month, sorry, per year for adults without children. So it's this kind of weird program where it's part child benefit, part earnings subsidy. So what the Romney bill does is it separates those entirely. It says, let's take out the child benefit section of that. So the EITC will not vary depending on family size. And we're actually going to make the EITC more generous per earner. So it goes from about $540 a year to about 1,000, not about, exactly 1,000 per year for each earner. And that also phases in and out, but the child tax credit or the child allowance now does not phase in at all with income. It's the maximum amount regardless of how much you earn for low earners. And then there's a couple other programs. So just breaking down the way the program works, we've got a child allowance here that costs about $230 billion between the $250 a month for older kids and $350 for younger kids. And then it creates this new worker credit that basically replaces the EITC, and it's more generous for single childless workers. And then the funding comes from repealing the child tax credit. It really replaces that benefit and makes it more generous. It also repeals the EITC. So it sort of takes the child piece and puts that into the child allowance, and then makes the worker credit more generous. And then the other main benefit that changes is temporary assistance for needy families. And this actually has been set at $16.5 billion since its introduction in 1996. So there was this big welfare reform bill back in 1996. It replaced a program called AFDC with TANF or TANF. And that's actually a block grant to the states. So the amount per child basically varies depending on how much a state is willing to chip in, kind of like Medicaid. So it hasn't changed much in its funding, hasn't changed at all. And also the amount that states spend, they have a lot of discretion, so they can choose, do you want to spend it on employment kind of programs, training programs, childcare, even like marriage counseling. So some of the more effective cash-oriented programs that they do are just regular cash assistance, more comparable to how AFDC worked before 1996. And also they have some EITC state matches that you can spend the money on. But those combined only raise, I think those are only about 30% of the total TANF funds. So really TANF does not reduce poverty very much anymore at all. And it's kind of widely abused. It's not really just that effective anymore. So this is one other program that goes into the child allowance and is liquidated. The other things are more tax pay-fors, which we can talk about.
And so, and now that we kind of have a general understanding of what the proposal is, like what are economists saying that the economic impacts of the Family Security Act would be?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is basically what you research with respect to the child allowance on top of other programs, which is the poverty impact. And it is very significant. So if you look at the poverty impact on children, it reduces it by 1/3. And deep poverty, which is defined as children below half the poverty threshold, that's cut in half. So this 33%, if you think about it compared to the research you did, Nate, where it cuts poverty by about half for a $300 a month child allowance, this is kind of close to that. It averages around 300, and it cuts it by 1/3. So basically replacing the other parts of the safety net to make it budget neutral, that cuts about 1/6, or maybe 1/3 of the remaining half of the poverty impact. So it's not actually that much, and it still remains extremely poverty effective. It also reduces poverty among adults, largely because a lot of adults are parents. So if your entire family is in poverty, you are as well as an adult, and also through the earner credit, which helps low-income childless people stay above the poverty threshold. So the overall effect on poverty nationwide is 14%, and it reduces deep poverty more by 17%. And I think this deep poverty impact is really, really important because a lot of the programs like what we saw here, a lot of these people are the ones who are in deep poverty and are really being neglected by the existing system. So even just filling in the amount, especially the fact that it's more generous. Also TANF, for example, has lifetime limits. So if you can't be on it for, depends on the state, but something like 4 years of your whole life. And there are work requirements as well. So you can't, if you don't comply with those programs, you can't benefit from TANF. It's also just not very generous at all. So the fact that we have something that's universal, hits people, if you're homeless, you will get this benefit if you're a homeless family. It really makes a big difference in terms of removing that deep poverty in the country.
You just want to quickly define deep poverty?
Yeah, so that's people below half the threshold, the poverty threshold. So if your family's threshold, depending on your geography, your housing costs, the number of people in your family, let's say that's $15,000 a year. These would be people below 7,500 with income below 7,500.
Maybe working backwards a little bit here, but did you just want to quickly discuss those tax provisions that in the remaining gap of the funding here? Yeah,
so as I mentioned, most of the funding for the program comes from the programs it basically replaces and makes more generous, the child tax credit, EITC, and TANF. The other big one is the state and local tax deduction. And this allows people to write off the amount of state and local taxes that they pay. So state income taxes, local property taxes, those kind of things on their federal tax return. And in general, deductions are regressive because when it reduces your tax liability, because we have a progressive tax system, that's going to be worth more in terms of after-tax money to high-income people than low-income people. It also doesn't do anything for people who are very poor, who don't owe net taxes in general in terms of federal taxes. So we'll see how progressive this is in a moment. 17 billion also comes from the head of household status. So there are 4 different filing statuses in the US. And this head of household status is one that allows you to, if you basically manage a household with some dependent in it, and that dependent spends at least half the time with you, you get to have some more favorable tax structures. So this is pretty unique to the US. Basically, no other country has this kind of filing status. And it's also fairly regressive because of the way it's structured. And then there's this program called the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. This is a pretty small program, and it is also not refundable. So it kind of has that phase-in structure as well. So it's not a major benefit to people. It's even more regressive than the child tax credit, because the child tax credit is partially refundable, which means if you don't owe any net federal income tax, you can still claim some benefit from it. Child dependent tax credit is not that way. And then the last little piece of funding here is $3 billion from the fact that TANF affects SNAP, which is food assistance in the US, or food stamps. So if you get TANF, you are, in some cases, automatically eligible for SNAP. And if there's no more TANF, then that saves some money. So, but basically that's a pretty small piece of it.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting that this is just the short term, that there might, like we discussed before, there's long-term benefits of a child allowance that might save more money down the road that's not in these projections.
Absolutely. If you think of the higher earnings among people who are less in poverty, lower crime, a whole bunch of things will go back into the government coffers through taxes and expenses.
And I wanted to really quick give you a chance to touch on some of the I'm struggling for the word, the arguments against people who are arguing against the Romney bill. I think we've seen some arguments on both sides. So starting with the argument that, why we should not be repealing welfare benefits. So how would you respond to someone who says, I'm against the Family Security Act, we shouldn't be repealing TANF, we shouldn't be repealing the child tax credit, et cetera? What's the response to that?
Yeah, I think our goal as social planners, I guess, and people in government and people advising government is to build the best welfare system we can make. And TANF is not that. It doesn't reach the poor. It's widely abused by states, especially more conservative states who might use it for programs that are just not effective. Work training programs are just not documented to help. So, and also for the poorer states, because it's a block grant, it doesn't help them nearly as much as rich states. California, I think, gets the most of any state, and they get something like 8 times the dollar amount of, I'm blanking on the state that has the lowest, but there's wide variance in terms of per capita, per child, how much does each state get? And it pretty much correlates to how rich that state is. So I think if we were designing a welfare state from today, liberals would not want something like TANF to be part of it. You can kind of think in the reverse. If we had a child allowance like the Romney plan, replacing even a few dollars of it for a program like TANF would be that's the kind of thing you might expect something like Trump to propose. When he was proposing replacing SNAP with sending people groceries to their door, this kind of moves in that direction.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it is coming from a good place in terms of a lot of these programs have really required a lot of energy from progressive activists to build and protect. And that's super admirable. But I don't think we should let that turn into status quo bias. This is a major upgrade in terms of our welfare state. And I think it's a really great sign that it can become bipartisan, as Romney's proposing.
Yeah, and I think we both may have some ideas on how the Family Security Act could be improved, but it's certainly better than the status quo. And then I guess we've seen arguments on the right that are worried about this decreasing labor incentives for parents. Did you just quickly want to touch on that and some of the research that
I wrote
we've seen?
Pretty big section on this. It's a complicated topic because labor supply, there's a lot of elements of this bill that could change different parts of the tax and transfer system to affect labor supply. And I think it sort of comes down to, well, this is all text, so I won't share it too much, but there are really two things that affect labor supply. One of them is actually I'll stop presenting for a sec and I'll come back to it for charts. One of them is when people get more money, they might work less because they can trade that time for leisure. And or child care, parenting, they can go into the home, they don't need to have earnings. And the second piece is if you're facing a higher marginal tax rate, you're going to work less because there's just less benefit to that marginal work hour compared to whatever else you might want to do with your time. So this does increase both of those in different ways. But I think there's been a really disproportionate emphasis on the first piece, which is called the income effect. And the research just suggests this is a very minor effect. There's been studies from UBI experiments like that in Alaska. The permanent fund dividend just does not reduce labor supply very much. And a whole bunch of other studies the Congressional Budget Office uses, they basically estimate kind of how important these two factors are when evaluating tax and benefit policy reforms. And they find that the first one just is pretty small across the board. So yes, the fact that this does give more money to people might allow some parents to just parent from home. That's kind of a luxury that a lot of higher income parents might have, especially if they're second earners or something like that. So I don't see that as a problem. And in some ways, if you look at TANF, for example, it actually can improve work incentives because if you're on TANF, in many cases, you're facing a phase out of that program of something like 50% of your income. So every dollar you earn on top of the normal tax rates, you're actually going to be paying or losing 50 cents of benefits for every dollar you earn. That's the setup here in California. On the other hand, people who are higher earners who now face higher tax rates because they no longer have the state and local tax deduction or the head of household filing status, that does kind of increase their effective marginal tax rates, which could reduce their labor supply. So I think it's probably true that this proposal would reduce labor supply overall. And that's largely just kind of inevitable if you're making the benefits system more generous because you have to pay for it and you're going to be giving money to some people. But relative to other ways you could do it, the fact that it's repealing programs like TANF, the fact that it's getting rid of the phase out of the child tax credit and the longer phase out of the EITC in earnings regions where people are pretty populated, I think this actually has a better effect on labor supply than a lot of ways of designing this could be.
Yeah, and I think you've made this point on Twitter. It's also kind of wordy in like what we count as labor, right? Like if a parent stops working their local shift to take care of their kid, that shows a reduction in labor. But some people might say, well, taking care of your child is labor. And even if we see a reduction in labor supply, is people spending more time with their kids necessarily a bad thing? I kind of wanted to, or we can kind of wrap up here. How would you make this proposal better? I think we both agree this is better than the status quo, but like, what are some ways that this bill can be improved? And if it passes, where do child allowance advocates go from there?
Yeah, I think one, it probably won't surprise this audience, making it fully universal would be one nice step. So there are two ways in which this isn't truly universal. One that we've talked about is that phases out with high incomes. So for singles over 200K, couples over 400K, and that really does not save very much money. I think it saves about $5 billion a year, according to Matt Brunig at the People's Policy Project. Another way is it has a benefit cap. So you can't get more than $12.50 a month from the benefit, which basically harms kids who are in families with many kids. So harms kids with more siblings. And that also only raises or saves about $2 billion a year. So these are both very small savings approaches, which really go against the philosophy of what a child allowance should be doing, which is ensuring that every kid is able to be taken care of, and that parents don't see the cost as much of an obstacle as they would otherwise. And really what's doing with the phase out is effectively a tax on high income parents. And there's not really a reason why we should be taxing parents more than other high income people. So I think just having some other tax reform that saves that money would be better. And then the benefit cap really just makes it more complicated for the IRS to verify and the Social Security Administration to verify how many kids you have. It could introduce some perverse incentives where maybe you want to split up the kids or something like that. It could affect timing of kids to make sure that you get the full benefit. It's just not really worth it. I think those are the two most important ones. I know there are some others, but do you have other thoughts on?
No, I think that is a pretty good point. I guess just I've been thinking a lot personally, like, okay, if this passes, where do people like us who advocate for the end of child poverty in America, where do we go from here in terms of advocacy or at the federal or state level? Just where do you see the child allowance movement going if this bill passes?
I think there's still a lot more generosity that child allowances could have. I mean, this would be a major step, but really cutting deep child poverty in half, we should aim for 0% deep child poverty. There's no reason we couldn't make that happen with a slightly larger child allowance, maybe making the earner credit more generous. There are a few people who are kind of low income who might come out behind from the existing design because of the way that EITC is structured relative to this program. These are kind of minor technical fixes, which if you just had some more revenue, you could imagine other tax reform to raise some more revenue, or the Biden plan basically just creates some money, it deficit spends the money. So if you're willing to deficit spend the tens of billions it's going to cost for the Biden plan to go into effect, you could throw that money into the Romney Family Security Act and you could bump up the amount pretty considerably. So I think those are basically making it more generous. And also once we have that infrastructure, this is why from a politics perspective, I think child allowance is really good for UBI. People are going to start wondering, okay, I get this money every month. Like, why do we still have food stamps, which is like not cash? Or why don't we set up a system where middle income people can get monthly payments, especially during recessions like we're going through right now? It's just, we're doing these sporadic payments all over the place. So I think the idea of using this as a model for more federal relief for kids and states to build on top of that, even local governments could see this as a model. All of that is a really positive step toward universality and more cash assistance.
Cool. Well, I think that covers about what we set out to discuss. Is there any last points you want to make?
No, I think one last thing, there has been some, I think progressives should really welcome some of the tax reforms that come with the Family Security Act. There's a lot of ways to raise revenue for benefits that are more generous. And this really does a good job of focusing it on progressive elements. So repealing the same local tax deduction, by far the upper decile, the topmost decile, really pays the biggest, the most of any decile in terms of a share of after-tax income. So it's really quite a progressive proposal on that basis. I think we should be willing to think about these more comprehensive proposals. It's something we're working on at the UBI Center as well, to think about how we simplify the tax structure so that we can simplify the safety net. These really go hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be the most interesting part of the bill, because it is kind of a political non-starter for Democrats for reasons that some people say are obvious, but don't seem obvious to me. Yeah, so I think we'll see probably some movement on the next relief package soon, and there's a chance that this is part of it. So I think people should look for discussions on child allowances in the news over the next week, and hopefully we see the closest thing to a child allowance the United States has ever had coming soon.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Nate. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And if you want to see our research, you can go to child-allowance.ubicenter.org to learn more. So
great.